Diane, hands where I can see them.
Okay, can we just figure something out?
Checks you've been cutting out of those trusts, it's 600 grand.
I can pay it back. I can pay all of it back today, right now.
Checks made out to you have a 90.
Kristi Carol Barger managed trust accounts for elderly clients and people with special needs at Relyance Bank for 6 years. Not one person checked. 25 accounts. Over $800,000. All of it gone.
Just let me make it right. Nobody has to lose anything. I will write the check this second.
She would not get to print another check. Within 48 hours, federal investigators would walk out of the Relyance Bank Trust Department with 6 years of internal records, 25 client files, and a stack of canceled checks bearing her own name in the payee line. $800,000, 25 trust accounts, mostly elderly clients, some living with special needs. Every one of them had been paying her to guard the money she was quietly moving into her own hands. The investigation would last more than a year. The prison sentence would last 12 months. The damage to the people she stole from would last the rest of their lives. Quick question before we go any further. Would you know how to read a trust statement if one landed in your mailbox tomorrow? Most of the victims in this case couldn't, and that's exactly why she chose them. Drop a yes or no in the comments. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. We cover the cases that target the people least able to fight back every single week. Kristi Carol Barger was born in 1971 in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, the county seat of Jefferson County and the largest town on the Arkansas River south of Little Rock. Her father worked 31 years as a maintenance supervisor at the International Paper Mill on the south end of town. Her mother taught second grade at Jack Roby Junior High before transferring to Watson Chapel Elementary in 1979. The family lived in a brick ranch on Belmore Drive, 2 miles from the mill, in a neighborhood where most of the streets had been named by paper company executives in the 1960s. Kristi was the middle of 3 children. Her older brother enlisted in the Navy out of high school. Her younger sister became a dental hygienist in Little Rock. Kristi was the one her mother called the practical one. She balanced the family checkbook by the time she was 14. She kept a small, loose-leaf notebook of her allowance, her babysitting income, and the slow accumulation of money she was setting aside for a car. She graduated from Pine Bluff High School in 1989. Her yearbook photo showed a young woman with shoulder-length brown hair, a soft smile, and a quiet expression that suggested she was paying attention to something the camera could not see. Under her name, the editors had listed 3 activities. Future Business Leaders of America, the school newspaper's business staff, the Math Honor Society. Her classmates voted her most likely to become a banker. She enrolled at the University of Arkansas at Monticello that fall on a partial academic scholarship. She majored in business administration with an emphasis in finance. She worked weekends as a teller trainee at a Simmons First Branch in Monticello for $6.25 an hour. She wore a navy blazer with a brass name tag that read, Kristi. She learned to count strapped bills, to balance a drawer to the penny, and to apologize gracefully to customers whose checks bounced. Her supervisor wrote on her first evaluation that she was, quote, exceptionally accurate, extremely polite, and shows real promise for a long career in retail banking. She graduated in 1993 and married James Barger, an electrician from Star City, that October. They moved to White Hall, the small bedroom community just north of Pine Bluff, and bought a 3-bedroom house on a cul-de-sac off Sheridan Road. She took a job as a customer service representative at a community bank in Pine Bluff. Her starting salary was $19,000 a year. Her first-year evaluation noted that she had learned the consumer loan system faster than any new hire her supervisor had trained in 20 years. She moved up, from customer service to personal banker, from personal banker to assistant branch manager, from assistant branch manager to consumer lending officer. Each promotion came with a small raise, a slightly larger desk, and a new line item on her business card. By 2002, she was a vice president on the consumer side. By 2008, she had crossed into wealth management. By 2012, she had earned the title that would eventually destroy her. Wealth Management Officer, Trust Department. The department was small. In a community bank the size of Relyance, The trust group occupied a single hallway on the second floor of the main office on West 28th Avenue in Pine Bluff. 3 officers, 2 assistants, 1 paralegal. They managed roughly 400 accounts for clients across southeast Arkansas. Farmers who had sold timberland, retirees who had collected railroad pensions for 40 years, widows who had inherited mineral rights, and a particular subset of clients whose accounts existed because no one else could manage them. Special needs trusts, court-appointed guardianships, settlement trusts for adults with cognitive impairments, accounts that, by their very structure, presupposed that the person whose name was on the paperwork could not watch the money themselves. Kristi was the one who handled those accounts. Her colleagues described her as the careful one, the patient one, the one who would sit with a 90-year-old widow for 2 hours explaining a quarterly statement line by line. Her supervisor wrote in her 2015 evaluation that she demonstrated exceptional empathy with vulnerable clients and consistently exceeded expectations for client retention. The bank gave her the Trust Officer of the Year plaque in 2016. It hung on the wall behind her desk, just above the rolling file cabinet where she kept the manila folders for every account she managed. A trust department is the strangest department in any bank. Every other corner of a bank operates on the principle that the customer is watching. Checking accounts get balanced. Loan payments get tracked. Credit card statements arrive in the mail every month. The customer sees what is happening to the money. A trust account is the opposite. A trust account exists precisely because someone cannot or should not watch the money themselves. Maybe they are too old. Maybe they have a disability that makes financial management impossible. Maybe a court has ruled that they need a fiduciary to act on their behalf. Maybe a parent died and left a child too young to understand what an estate is. Whatever the reason, the structure is the same. The client signs paperwork giving the bank legal authority to hold and manage the money. The bank, in turn, assigns an officer to that account. That officer becomes the human face of the institution's fiduciary duty. At Relyance Bank, the trust officer assigned to most of the elderly and special needs accounts was Kristi Barger. Her authority on those accounts was almost total. She could issue disbursements. She could write checks against the account. She could move money between sub-accounts. She could approve transfers to vendors, caretakers, nursing homes, and pharmacies. She could authorize the printing of a bank check drawn on the trust's funds, with any payee she chose to type into the field. The system did not stop her. The system was designed to assume she would not abuse it. The bank had safeguards. There was a dual control requirement for disbursements above a certain threshold. There was a quarterly internal audit of randomly selected trust files. There was an annual examination by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. There was a compliance officer whose job was to flag unusual patterns. On paper, the controls looked thorough, but every safeguard had the same hidden flaw. They all assumed the trust officer was working in good faith. The dual control review trusted Kristi's description of why a check was being issued. The quarterly audit sampled only a tiny percentage of accounts. The OCC examination came once a year and lasted a few days. The compliance officer reviewed exception reports generated by a system Kristi knew intimately, and she knew which thresholds triggered which alerts. She had been there a long time. She had been the careful one for a long time. No one looked at her work the way they would have looked at a new hire's. The clients themselves were the final layer of protection, and the layer most easily defeated. The elderly clients received quarterly statements in the mail. Some of them had children or attorneys who reviewed those statements. Many of them did not. The special needs clients, by definition, could not read their own statements in any meaningful sense. The court-appointed guardians for some accounts were elderly themselves. The system was built for clients who were watching. The accounts on Kristi's desk belonged to clients who could not. The first check was for $3,700. It was issued on April 14, 2014. It was drawn on the trust account of an 83-year-old retired schoolteacher who had moved into the memory care wing of a nursing home in Pine Bluff 6 months earlier. Her trust paid her facility bills, her medications, and her supplemental insurance. The check on April 14th was made payable to a credit card company. The payee line did not say her name. It said the Visa account number that belonged to Kristi Carol Barger. Federal investigators would later describe that first check as the moment when the line between trust officer and thief became invisible to anyone outside the bank's internal systems. The amount was small. It would not trigger any compliance alert. The payee, a major credit card company, would not look suspicious on a transaction report. Only the account number on the credit card statement, sitting on Kristi's kitchen counter in Whitehall, identified who the money was actually going to. She waited 2 months before the second check. That one was for $4,200, drawn on a different trust account, also made payable to a credit card company. The third came 3 weeks later. The fourth, a month after that. By the end of 2014, she had moved roughly $27,000 out of 4 separate client trust accounts and into her own personal finances. The pattern that emerged over the next 6 years was clinical. She would identify trust accounts with 2 characteristics: substantial balances and clients who were unable to review their own statements. She would print checks in amounts small enough to avoid scrutiny, usually between $2,000 and $5,000. She would make them payable to her credit card companies, her car loan lender, her mortgage company, and a small rotation of personal vendors. She would log the disbursements in the bank's system with vague but plausible descriptions: medical expenses, caretaker reimbursement, property tax payment. The notations were short enough not to invite questions and specific enough to look like the routine business of managing an elderly client's affairs. She did not spend the money on anything extravagant. There was no second house, no boat, no tropical vacations. The Federal Financial Analysis would later describe her spending as overwhelmingly defensive. She paid down credit card balances. She made car payments. She covered her mortgage in months when her family's income fell short. She paid medical bills. She paid for her children's school activities. The money was not feeding a luxury habit. It was feeding the slow, steady financial drowning of a middle-class family that had borrowed more than it could pay back, and had been borrowing more than it could pay back for years. By 2017, she had drawn from 12 different client accounts. By 2019, she was drawing from 21. The total had crossed $500,000. The frequency had increased. The amounts had grown. A check that started at $3,700 in 2014 was $9,000 by 2019, then $12,000. Then, in the early months of 2020, 15. Her colleagues did not notice. The annual OCC examinations did not flag her. The quarterly internal audits, with their narrow sampling, never landed on the accounts she was draining. The compliance reports she generated for her own department showed a careful, attentive officer managing complicated accounts with admirable consistency. She continued to receive positive performance reviews. She continued to receive small annual raises. She continued to be the careful one. The accounts she was stealing from belonged to 25 people whose names she knew by heart. A widow in Sheridan who had lost her husband to a logging accident in 1998. A man in his late 70s in Star City whose only family was a daughter living in Texas. A woman with Down syndrome in her 40s whose parents had died within a year of each other and whose entire inherited estate sat in the trust account Kristi managed. A retired pipefitter in Pine Bluff who had suffered a stroke at 61 and could no longer balance a checkbook. A man in his 80s whose son had set up a special needs trust for his grandson with autism and who reviewed the statements once a year on Christmas Eve by the kitchen window of his house on West 28th Avenue. She knew their names. She had met some of them. She had sat across from them at her desk and listened to them describe their fears about money, their hopes for their children, their understanding of what a trust account was for. She had told them, in those meetings, that they did not need to worry. The bank would handle it. The bank would protect their money. That was what trust departments existed for. The bank caught her. That detail would become the small mercy of the case. Not a victim's family, not an outside regulator, not a tip from a colleague, the institution itself. In the late spring of 2020, a routine internal review at Relyance Bank flagged an anomaly. The exact trigger has never been described publicly, but the most likely explanation, based on the bank's later public statements, is that a pandemic-driven shift in operations exposed something that ordinary day-to-day activity had been hiding. In March and April of 2020, branches across the country adjusted their workflows. Drive-through windows replaced lobby visits. Internal audits moved to remote review. Compliance officers worked from home and looked at the same exception reports from different angles. Something in that change made a pattern visible that had been invisible before. The bank's internal investigators pulled trust department records from 2018 forward. They cross-referenced disbursement notations against vendor invoices. They compared payee names on issued checks against the bank's approved vendor lists. They asked one question that no one had thought to ask in clear terms before. Who exactly was being paid from these accounts? The answer, in many cases, was Kristi Barger, or her credit card company, or her mortgage servicer, or the auto loan lender for her family's SUV. On June 18, 2020, Relyance Bank suspended her. The suspension was quiet. There was no public announcement. There was no press release. The bank's executives understood immediately that they were standing on top of a story that could destroy the institution's reputation in Southeast Arkansas if it leaked before they had a complete picture of what had happened. They needed to know the total. They needed to know how many clients. They needed to know whether any money could be recovered. And they needed to make a decision about how to make the affected accounts whole before any client noticed a missing dollar. The internal investigation expanded. The bank's lawyers were called in. The office of the Comptroller of the Currency was notified. By the end of the summer, the bank had a working number for the OCC investigation: $384,000 drawn from wealth management customer accounts between June 1, 2018 and June 18, 2020. That figure would later be confirmed in an OCC consent order banning Kristi from the banking industry. But the bank's own forensic accountants kept looking back further. The pattern they had identified in the 2018 to 2020 window had a beginning, and they followed it. By the time federal prosecutors took the case, the documented total had grown. $800,000, 25 trust accounts, a scheme that began in April 2014 and ran without interruption until the day the suspension paperwork landed on her desk. The bank's CEO, Chuck Morgan, would eventually say publicly that not one customer or client lost any money. Relyance made every trust account whole. The institution absorbed the loss. The fiduciary duty the bank had promised those clients, the duty Kristi had personally violated for 6 years, was honored at the corporate level even after it had been shattered at the individual one. Before we get into the federal case, here is what stays with me about this one. The bank caught her, not the victims, not their families. The institution that was supposed to be the last line of defense was also the only line of defense, because the people whose accounts she drained could not read their own statements. If that bothers you the way it bothers me, leave a comment. Subscribe if you haven't. We tell the stories that don't make the evening news because the victims couldn't speak up for themselves. The case was referred to the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Arkansas. The lead investigators were federal agents working under the Department of Justice's Elder Justice Initiative, a designation reserved for cases in which the victims were primarily older adults or persons with cognitive or developmental disabilities. The Barger case fit both prongs of that definition. The victim list, when it was finally complete, contained 25 names. 23 of the 25 were over the age of 70. 4 of the 25 had documented cognitive impairments. 2 were beneficiaries of special needs trusts. The documentary evidence was already in the bank's possession. Federal agents did not need to subpoena it. They walked into the Relyance Trust Department in the summer of 2021 and took custody of 6 years of records that the bank had already compiled, organized, and cross-referenced. The folders were stacked on a conference room table in the order Kristi herself had maintained for years. The bank's internal investigators had done most of the prosecutorial work before the federal case was opened. The smoking gun was the checks, hundreds of them, each one printed on Relyance Bank's official trust department check stock. each one drawn on a specific client account, each one signed by Kristi Carol Barger in the authorized signer line. Each one made payable to Capital One, or to Chase Mortgage, or to Alley Auto, or, in some cases, simply to Kristi Carol Barger. The financial forensic accountants traced every check to a specific personal expense. A credit card payment of $4,200 drawn on the trust account of a 91-year-old retired teacher in Pine Bluff matched to the dollar and to the day a payment posted to Kristi's personal Capital One account. A check for $9,000 drawn on the special needs trust of an adult woman with Down syndrome matched a payment to the mortgage servicer for the Barger family home on Sheridan Road. A check for $12,000 drawn on the trust of a stroke victim in Pine Bluff matched the balance owed on the Barger family's GMC Acadia. The matching was perfect. Each theft had a destination. Each destination had a paper trail. The investigators did not have to prove intent through circumstantial argument. They had Kristi's own signature on Relyance Bank's own checks, making payments she could not deny. There were no text messages. There was no co-conspirator. There was no second set of books. The crime was almost entirely solitary, conducted in plain view of a banking system that trusted her to do exactly the opposite of what she was doing. The investigators interviewed her colleagues. None of them had suspected. They interviewed her supervisors. None of them had seen the pattern. They interviewed the OCC examiners who had cleared the trust department in 5 consecutive annual reviews. None of those examiners had found anything to flag. What the investigators did find, in interviews with the affected families, was the human cost of a crime that had not, by the bank's accounting, cost anyone any money. The daughter of an 87-year-old victim in Sheridan said her mother had asked, in her final lucid weeks before a major stroke, whether there was enough money in her trust to pay for the headstone she wanted. There had been. There had been even after Kristi had taken $11,000 from the account. But the daughter, learning later what had happened, said the question her mother asked was the question Kristi had been answering for 6 years by stealing the answer. The interview happened on a Tuesday afternoon in November of 2021. Kristi had been off the bank's payroll for 17 months by then. She had not been formally charged. Federal agents had been to her house once already, the previous summer, to collect financial records. This was the formal sit-down. 2 agents. A conference room at the federal building in Fort Smith. Her attorney in the chair beside her. The lead agent set a folder on the table. He opened it. He turned a single check around so it faced her. Agent, Mrs. Barger, can you identify the signature on this check? She looked at it. She did not look up. Kristi, that's my signature. Agent, and the account this check is drawn on. Can you identify the account holder? A long pause. Kristi, yes. Agent, could you state the account holder's name for the record? She named the client, an elderly woman who had been a Relyance Trust client for 19 years, a woman who had died in 2019 without ever knowing that Kristi had taken $63,000 from her account. Agent, and the payee on this check? Kristi, Capital One. Agent, whose Capital One account? Her attorney spoke before she could. He asked for a recess. The agents agreed. When the interview resumed, Kristi spoke quietly for the next 2 hours. She did not deny. She did not justify. She answered every question with short, factual sentences. She acknowledged the checks. She acknowledged the accounts. She acknowledged the destinations. When asked why, she said only that she had needed the money. When asked when she had first taken money, she said April of 2014. When asked when she had last taken money, she said early June of 2020. When asked if there was anyone else involved, she said no. The lead agent asked one final question. Agent, Mrs. Barger, did the clients whose accounts you took money from know what you were doing? She shook her head. Kristi, no, they trusted me. The interview ended. She signed her statement. She walked out of the federal building with her attorney and drove the 2.5 hours back to Whitehall. The criminal information would be filed 18 months later. The case was docketed in the United States District Court for the Western District of Arkansas as case number 623 CR 600-32. The charging instrument was a criminal information rather than a grand jury indictment. In federal practice, a criminal information almost always indicates that the defendant has agreed to waive indictment and proceed by negotiated plea. The Barger case followed that pattern. There was no trial. There was no jury. There was no contested hearing on the facts. The bank's records told the story, and the defendant did not dispute them. She was convicted in 2023. Sentencing was set for March 12, 2024. The sentencing hearing was held in the federal courthouse. The courtroom was small. The gallery was mostly empty. A handful of family members of victims attended. One of them, the daughter of the 87-year-old woman who had asked about the headstone, gave a victim impact statement. She spoke for less than 4 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She said her mother had spent her last years worrying about whether she was being a financial burden on her children. Her mother, she said, would have wanted to know that the money in her trust was being managed by someone who cared about her. Instead, the woman who had been paid to care about her mother had used that money to make car payments. Daughter: I'm not asking the court for anything in particular. My mother is gone. The money was made whole by the bank. But I want it on the record that the woman in this room stole from a woman who could not see, could not walk, and could not read her own statements. She stole because she could. She stole for 6 years, and she would still be stealing if the bank had not finally noticed. The judge accepted the plea agreement and the recommended sentence. Kristi Carol Barger was sentenced to 12 months in federal custody. Her supervised release terms required full restitution to Relyance Bank, which had absorbed the loss, and a permanent ban from any employment involving financial fiduciary duties. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency had already, separately, banned her from the banking industry for life, under a consent order she had signed without admitting or denying wrongdoing. She is scheduled to be released in early 2025. She will be in her mid-50s. She will return to Whitehall, to the house on the cul-de-sac off Sheridan Road. Her banking career is over. Her name appears on a public OCC enforcement list that will exist as long as the agency does. The 25 trust accounts she drained have been made whole, dollar for dollar, by the institution that employed her. The redemption in this case is institutional, not personal. The bank made the victims whole. The clients did not lose a cent. The system, in the end, absorbed the damage. But the 12-month sentence sits against 6 years of theft, and the gap between the regulator's $384,000 and the criminal file's $800,000 is a reminder of how much of a fiduciary theft can hide inside the plumbing of an institution before anyone notices. The cruelty was not dramatic. It was quiet and clerical and aimed precisely at the people least able to see it coming. This case was quiet, but the next case on the right-hand side is anything but. Click it now.